Today is June 16th, 2022, and my guest is the oncologist, Dr. Vinay Prasad. His first appearance on EconTalk was April of 2020, discussing cancer drugs in his book, Malignant. Our topic for today is COVID-19, what we've learned, what we shouldn't have learned, and what we still have to learn. Vinay, welcome back to EconTalk.
It's great to be back, Russ. And of all the things I've ever done, I think I've gotten more positive emails by going on your show than anything else.
Well, when you cure cancer, I'll slip down to number 2, but I appreciate that. I appreciate that very much. I want to start about vaccines. We recently talked to Greg Zuckerman about vaccines here, and let's be honest, it is an extraordinary human achievement. I've waxed as eloquently as I can about the speed with which we developed the vaccine, which a handful of people developed the vaccines. And the lives that have been saved. How effective are they, though? Because I just got COVID 2 weeks ago. I was triple boosted, meaning I've had the original 2 doses. I took a 3rd dose, I think, about 9 months ago, and I was told that if I didn't get a 4th dose, I was a fool. And I was, by the way, this is one of my favorite cocktail party moments of all time. The person said, obviously, I had allowed my political biases to overwhelm my rationality. And I just said, I don't think you know me so well, so let's just leave that alone. But I'm curious your take on that, both the question of whether I should have gotten a 4th shot, if that's an answerable question, and just generally the fact that people who have the vaccine are still getting the disease. What should we learn about this?
Absolutely. So I guess one more piece of background for your listeners is that, of course, in addition to being an oncologist, I'm actually an epidemiologist and biostatistician. I'm in Department of Epi and Biostats as my primary appointment. And so that's the lens through which I view a lot of COVID policy, the epidemiology lens. The answer to your question, I think I totally agree that vaccines were probably one of the greatest breakthroughs throughout the pandemic. The timeline was something that even the optimists weren't bullish enough about. Nobody saw it coming that quickly. Maybe the only person who saw it coming that quickly was Trump, and people thought he was out of his mind to say that it was coming so quickly. It's truly a remarkable feat, and I think there's no doubt about it. The vaccines lower the risk of severe disease and hospitalization, and that is very, very clear, particularly among older, frailer people. And that's the group you wanted to protect, because that's the group of people that was most hard hit by COVID-19. Now, like all medical interventions, the reason vaccines get into debates isn't that anyone debates that they have a value in an 85-year-old. It's that as you go down and down to lower and lower risk, and you get to, as we're going to talk about soon, very young children, or as you talk about additional doses, dose after dose after dose, you get into the business of diminishing returns. And at some point, you start to wonder, what returns are you getting at all? And the way in medicine we typically sort these out is larger and larger randomized trials. You're looking for smaller and smaller signals. You need larger and larger sample size. But what we found with the regulatory system around vaccines and boosters and second boosters is as we've moved along, we've gotten less and less data. So for instance, the regulatory authorization of that 4th dose, which in the United States is only granted for people over the age of 50, is actually a little bit more generous than what Pfizer wanted, which I think was over the age of 65, and it was the FDA gave them a little bit more. And it was broadly on the basis that we can improve your antibody levels to what they had been a little bit before, and not necessarily that we're proving that a 51-year-old man, for instance, who's in excellent health, no one in my mind has proven that that person has a further reduction in severe disease or hospitalization by getting the 4th dose. And that's why I think this has become so debatable, because, to be honest, there's a lot of uncertainty. Now, I think most people would say that we believe the 3rd dose definitely benefits older people. And the reason we believe that is observational studies that are done in many countries, but particularly the most notable come from Israel, where people who get that 3rd dose appear to have a further reduction in severe disease and hospitalization than people who don't get that 3rd dose. But of course, in Israel, there are some confounding factors. One is, I think the Arab population has always been slower to get the extra vaccine, and the people who are getting it are of higher socioeconomic status, and they may be doing other things in their life that are, And so, I think we have to put a grain of salt next to all these things. And the last thing I'll say before I'll take it, the last thing I'll say is the places that are the most hotly debated are the places where you really wonder whether or not those extra doses matter. In the United States, many colleges, I think over 300, now mandate a 20-year-old college boy get the third dose. And there's no exemption for whether or not he's just had COVID. By the way, he had 2 doses in COVID. He's got to get the third dose or he's going to be expelled from school. That's an age group where the risks are much lower. The evidence is very weak that the third dose would benefit him. I don't think there's any credible evidence that somebody who had COVID and recovered and getting a booster in the aftermath has a subsequent reduction in severe disease or death from getting COVID again, ostensibly. And so I think that, and then there's a downside, which is risk of myocarditis, which we can talk about, which is the one safety signal that has emerged from mRNA vaccines. And so that's the place where all the heat is because it's the most uncertain.
Let's talk about myocarditis, which is, did I say that correctly?
Yep.
That's a side effect. It's funny. I would have felt uneasy mentioning a side effect at some point in this journey because, people might misinterpret it and think you shouldn't get the vaccine. And again, I want to make it clear, I gladly got the vaccine. I gladly got the 2-dose vaccine. I gladly got the booster. I would also suspect that myocarditis is not the only side effect. So, am I correct? Let me just add that when someone said to me, "Oh, you have to get the 4th booster," what are you, an idiot? You're 67 years old. You're at risk. My view was, and perhaps I'm crazy. I'm playing with my immune system, and I don't know if we know a lot about what happens when you keep asking your body to produce these antagonists to these things we're introducing in our body. And it just struck me as the fourth dose would be relatively small in helping me. And I wasn't comfortable or confident about the downside. Now, I should add that when I got COVID 2 weeks ago, I'm in pretty good health. I'm a little bit overweight. I don't think I'm not obese, I think, to the human eye, although I may be to the medical establishment, let me confess. And I'm 67. It was really unpleasant. I coughed really badly, really hard for 3 days. I coughed well, but unpleasantly for 3 days. My stomach hurt just from the coughing. My nose was running constantly. I was sneezing. I didn't run a fever, but I haven't really felt like myself until about yesterday. So it was 2 weeks of dragging around. I really wish I hadn't gotten it. And I was really uneasy. I'd had a meeting with somebody older than myself the day before I exhibited the symptoms, and I feared I'd given it to her. I don't think I did, turns out, fortunately, but it is really bad. So I would have liked to have avoided that. Do we know anything about whether the 4th booster would have at least reduced that? What do what do you think the risks are?
Okay, so I guess the last question first. I think the unfortunate thing is that all of these vaccines that we're talking about, it's the original Wuhan ancestral strain and the spike protein that strain made. And now we have Omicron, which is to some degree an immune escape variant. It has a different shape, and they're developing Omicron-specific vaccines, which I'll come back to. But the challenge with that is, and many studies show, that as time goes out from your last booster dose, whenever that last booster dose was, and whatever number it was, 4 or 3, or even the second dose, as time goes out, your vaccine effectiveness, the probability that vaccine is going to protect you against getting COVID-19, goes closer and closer to 0. Some estimates say 0, some say 12%. But when you talk about vaccine effectiveness that low, then it's not a question of it's not a question of if I will get COVID-19, it's when will I get COVID-19, because it's only a matter of time if it keeps circulating and people have very, very poor vaccine effectiveness. We're all going to get breakthrough infection. And I think even Anthony Fauci admitted that a few weeks ago. In terms of the risks, I put it in 2 buckets. One thing to talk about is there a risk from getting booster after booster of the original ancestral strain? And I think largely people don't know. It's a bit theoretical. But once upon a time, we do know one thing, which is there is something called imprinting or original antigenic sin. And the basic idea is many years ago, we knew that the cervical cancer was caused by the human papillomavirus, of which there are many, many, many types. The original Gardasil vaccine had 4 serotypes in it, I think 6, 11, and then 2 in the 30s. It had 4 different strains of the HPV in it, and we vaccinated a lot of girls with that. Later, they developed a non-valent vaccine. 9 different strains of the of the HPV were in that vaccine. And if you took a girl who had never gotten the 4 and gave her the 9, she'll have antibodies against all the 9 different strains. But if you took a girl who had gotten the 4 and gave her the 9, she has antibodies against all of them, but it's a little bit diminished to the new 5 and strongest to the original 4 because the immune system is being trained on the original 4. And so this is the idea of imprinting original antigenic sin. How does that relate to this situation? If indeed we get to the situation where in the fall we have an Omicron-specific vaccine, or next year we have a vaccine specific to the strain, it might be, I don't know it to be, but it might be theoretically possible that the fact somebody has gotten more boosters of the original strain makes it a little bit, makes their response stimulate antibodies to the original spike protein epitopes and not necessarily the new parts that we've changed. So that's a potential theoretical downside. Of course, nobody knows. You can't prove it until it comes. And then the last bucket, the non-theoretical downside. I mean, I think there are many side effects of the vaccine, from fatigue, weakness, arm pain. I mean, these are the things, but I think those are things people mostly accept. The one side effect that came sort of unanticipated and has really implications, I think, for safe vaccination, and I want to stress that that's my position, is not that we don't or do, it's that we do it as safely as possible, and that is myocarditis. Myocarditis is inflammation of the muscle of the heart, often precipitated after a viral illness or something. That's typically how we see myocarditis. But it was very clear, and the Israelis were the first to note, that after mRNA vaccination, particularly among boys between the ages of, 12 and 26, and now we even see maybe 10 and 11-year-olds and up to 30, men more than women after the mRNA vaccine, more after dose 2, and maybe a little bit more after Moderna than Pfizer, they have rates of myocarditis that are non-trivial. Israel's original estimate was 1 in 3,000 to 1 in 5,000 after dose 2 of the Pfizer vaccine. Now, why does that matter? This is a serious adverse event. It often leads people to come into the hospital. They always say it's mostly mild, okay, but it may not always be mild. There are definitely people who suffer from arrhythmias as a result, and there are people who have a heart that's not squeezing as good. And it mostly recovers, but again, there are still some people who are suffering long-lasting effects from this. And the reason I think it's so important is that it's very difficult for me to look a 20-year-old healthy college student in the eye, and after they've gotten 1 dose, they come to your clinic and, you're within the time period. Is it truly in their best interest to get that second dose right then and there? And the answer is they're going to take a 1 in 3,000 risk of this, I think, non-trivial event. And is the benefit, the further reduction in hospitalization, is that in the 1 in 3,000 ballpark, or is that in the 1 in 30,000 or 1 in 300,000 ballpark? Because they're so young and healthy anyway. And I think that's why it's kind of that particular side effect has a lot of implications. A number of countries, Denmark has banned Moderna in people under 40. Kaiser Permanente in Northwest here recently said we prefer Pfizer over Moderna. Other countries have spaced the doses apart. And all these things are done in effort to lower the myocarditis risk while taking the benefit of vaccination. But then to come back to your situation, I think had you gotten the 4th dose, I'm not sure you would have avoided COVID-19. You might have kicked the can down the road another month. I'm sorry that you had to go through it, but I do worry that eventually we'll all have to go through it.
So on the myocarditis, defenders of the vaccine for wider populations have argued that the risk of myocarditis from COVID is higher than the risk from the vaccine. So the vaccine, even if it has a risk of myocarditis, is still better than getting it. Do you disagree with that?
I guess I'd say I've heard them say that, and I would say that if you have a choice in this life, that it's better to get vaccinated and then get COVID than get COVID before ever getting vaccinated. That's true as well. So I'm a supporter of vaccination, but I think here's what they have a problem with some of their analyses. Some of these studies are looking at the risk of myocarditis after vaccination, but they're including 85-year-old women with 20-year-old men. But the risk is hugely different between those two groups. So if you stratify by age and sex and dose and product, you start to see different signals. And then the next thing I would say is that, everybody, after you get every dose, you have, there's a fork in the choice. I get one dose and I have a choice to get the second dose. And I'll admit personally, I rushed to get dose 1. I rushed to get it. I was a healthcare worker. I rushed. Dose 2, I was a little bit more ambivalent about. I wasn't sure that I needed it on that time schedule. I delayed it a little bit. And dose 3, I thought, I'm a 39-year-old person, no medical problems. I thought that I wasn't convinced it was in my best interest to do, but I did it because, of course, I'm victim of a mandate, which we can talk about. But back to your point, is myocarditis, I think there is no doubt in my mind that for a 22-year-old man who's already gotten one dose of mRNA and they're coming into the office for dose 2, and let's say it's Moderna, so it's the day 28 dose 2, the risk of myocarditis is higher if they get the Moderna, and then they will eventually get a breakthrough, versus if they just go along and get their breakthrough. The risk of myocarditis is clearly higher. There's a number of papers that would prove that. Nature Medicine paper, I've written some post about that. So I think it's not always true. And I think that's important because that can allow you to tailor your vaccine policy.
What do you mean they get a breakthrough? A breakthrough of what?
I guess I would say that I use the word breakthrough to mean that anybody who's had any vaccine who nevertheless gets COVID-19, I call that a breakthrough infection. That's the term I would use.
I'm going to recommend a different phrase.
Okay.
A breakthrow sounds good.
Yes,
this is not good.
It's not good.
Well, you can think about that after we're done.
You're right.
And so a lot of people argue, I think, from the data, that the immunity I now have as a sufferer from COVID-19 is better than if I'd gotten a vaccine. Is that correct?
Well, I guess I would say that there's a bit of a survivor bias because, of course, if you imagine that a lot of people got COVID-19, some of them are not alive at the end of it. Right. And so among the survivors, their health is, you've weeded out the sickest people. So I just want to point that out. That's often biased. But there is a good study. It appears in MMWR. It looks at New York State and California State. And what they do is they say, after vaccination, what's the risk of severe disease or hospitalization from a subsequent COVID-19 episode? And after you've had and recovered from it, and after you've had and recovered from it and gotten vaccinated. And I think it shows mostly that if you've had and recovered from it going into the future, the risk was so abysmally low, the curve is like hugging the x-axis, that and after you've been vaccinated, it's still low, much lower than it would be if you're unvaccinated, but it's not quite as low as natural immunity. Now, of course, there is that survivor bias there too, but I guess I would say that I cannot tell you that you won't get COVID again. You might. In fact, I'm sure with enough time you will get COVID again. But what I suspect is you won't get it as bad. It'll be milder and milder every time you get it. And I suspect that your risk of getting severe disease or hospitalization from COVID, now that you've had and recovered from it, is very, very low. So low that one wouldn't change one's life.
Let's talk about getting it again. In the early days when it was much more severe, the Wuhan what's the right language?
Strain, yeah, the Wuhan
strain. It was a frightening time. I was afraid to go to the grocery. I was wiping down cans. It was afraid to get my mail. People are still doing some of that, by the way. It's fascinating. When I was recovered from COVID, I gave, but only like a week and a bit out, I gave someone a book, and he didn't want to touch it. So if you want to comment on that behavior, I'd be interested. I told him I thought it was probably okay, given that it had been over a week, and I didn't think the surface thing mattered. But, who am I? I don't even play a doctor on TV. So, but the interesting thing to me is that in the early days, we all thought, well, if you get it, it can be horrible. A number of people got it, had a bad experience, but never had to go to the hospital, never went on a ventilator. And then we all said, well, lucky you, you're now immune, because that's the way we thought about things. And then there was this rumor or occasional possibility that someone had gotten it again. And at that time, most people responded to that. Thoughtful people were like, well, there are false positives. Maybe you didn't have it the first time. Maybe you didn't really have it the second time. Right. Now we're suddenly in a world where, oh yeah, you're going to get it again. What changed there? What did we learn something we didn't know before? What's going on?
This will also come under the section heading of things public health distorted or sort of didn't say perfectly accurately that have plagued us over time. But I would say that before SARS-CoV-2 entered the scene, we had 4 circulating coronaviruses, and people expected and knew and was well documented that you could get it episodically every few years, and that's why they would keep circulating. That immunity against coronavirus might be good in terms of coronavirus very rarely made someone very sick. And often when it did, they were older and frailer and in the nursing home. I'm talking about regular old coronavirus. But it was known that there would be inevitably immune escape and we'd get colds. The common cold is a mix of viruses, rhinovirus, coronavirus, adenovirus. And it's well accepted that we would just get it sort of cyclically. And I think most people who thought about it realized that SARS-CoV-2 would probably eventually fit the same pattern, and a number of Europeans wrote about this, and I think they've always been more comfortable with that idea. I think some of the early cases that we talk about, though, there is some ambiguity, because you always want to separate. Did you really get COVID, completely cleared it, and then you got it again? Or did you get COVID and it just never really cleared? And of course, there's a fraction of people, particularly people who are immunosuppressed, that it never really clears, and they may have had long-standing, just sort of smoldering SARS-CoV-2 for a long time. And some believe that that is the basis by which the variants have evolved, like Omicron. Where did it come from? It came from somebody who was chronically immunosuppressed and just allowed it to replicate in them over and over again. So I guess, but why did we say that? I think two things are both true. That one, that we will get COVID-19 again, but we do know that, and we now have the evidence that if you get it a second time, the likelihood you're going to get sicker than you got the first time is very low. I mean, I think it's far less than, I think if I recall correctly, I want to say 0.3%, but it's very, very low. And so it's an unlikely event. And in that case, I think that is a little bit reassuring.
Then if that's true, what was all that conversation in the early days of the pandemic about herd immunity? Because what you're really saying is that there's no such thing. It's a phantom, a fantasy that, if you can literally only get it once, and then a bunch of people either have gotten it or have been vaccinated against it, which again was thought, I think, by many of us early days, like, well, I'm protected, nothing to worry about now.
Right.
If it's true that you can obviously get it again, what's with this whole herd immunity thing? And what was the countries that based their policies on a strategy like that? And at various times, I think that would include the United States. Certainly, it was discussed as Sweden's policy. Or am I wrong? I don't know.
No, you're right. I mean, I guess I would say that herd immunity really applies for a situation where you have a virus that after you've had and recovered from it or been vaccinated against it, you have a long-term sterilizing immunity and you're unlikely to get it again. And then there's a mathematical equation, 1 minus 1 over R naught, or the rate of spread, that gives you the herd immunity fraction. And of course, this is also something that Fauci famously stepped in because he was found to be kind of cooking the herd immunity number to suit his policy preferences and not what he actually thought. Now, why did people fall in love with the idea that once we get to this magical number, the virus will just go away? I think to some degree it might have been wishful thinking. And maybe to some degree I also succumbed to that wishful thinking that maybe this vaccine is so good. And the original reports were that it was stunningly good. And we didn't have Omicron. We didn't see that immune escape variant right there. And so I think many people thought that maybe we'll be in that situation. The other thing that changed is the R coefficient or rate of spread. Omicron is explosive. I mean, and once R goes very high in that number, herd immunity goes over 100%. So it's a moot point anyway. We're all going to get it. But I think it goes back to the models, the original Imperial College London model, which, didn't quite come as promised. It was less than that. And a number of the fearful models that led to sort of the global shutdown, which is that all of these things are imperfect, rudimentary sort of surrogates for how the world should be. And herd immunity and that concept, that equation, all the modeling, it's all very rudimentary. And so I guess we shouldn't be surprised that it didn't actually hold up. But I don't know if it was malice as much as wishful thinking.
We'll come back to Fauci in a minute. I might try to defend him. Won't be easy for me, but I'm going to give it a shot. But I want to react to something you just said. It was more body language and maybe some eyebrow work that it may be not visible to those listening on audio only. You made what I would call a semi-disparaging allusion to lockdown and various responses that we had, and we'll talk. I hope we'll talk a little bit about school closings and other things. We'll get to children in a minute, in particular with respect to the vaccine. So I want to finish up the vaccine, but I want to ask the following question before we get there. In the early days of the pandemic, there was some experimentation that took place at the national level, and some of that experimentation was due to various policymakers having more authority. Some of it was due to cultural differences across countries. Some of it was due to who knows what. But would you disagree with the statement that the countries that pursued the most aggressive lockdowns had the most success in preventing death? So my impression, I have mixed feelings about the lockdowns, and that phrase, I don't even like that phrase actually, because it covers a wide range of both official policy and actual response. Because some places locked down and they really locked down, and other places locked down and it was like kind of. But for the places that really locked down, I have a son who lives in Australia. Australia locked down. You couldn't get into the country. You couldn't get out of the country. When you got there, you had to spend 2 weeks in a hotel, and so on and so on. But they've had very low death rates, and they may have paid a price for the lockdown in terms of economic viability, all kinds of human flourishing factors that are relevant. But weren't they at least successful in keeping their deaths down?
My honest view on this is that I think this will be one of the great economics questions for the next quarter century, because there's a lot of things. And I'll just give you a few factors that I think about as to why it's such a hard question to unpack. I think one thing to be said is that pre this pandemic, the idea that lockdowns would even be in the toolbox was antithetical to public health. I think that's clear from writings of D.A. Henderson and others. George W. Bush commissioned a commission to look into pandemic response, and nobody felt this was even in the toolbox. It was only when people saw what China did in Wuhan that we even got the inkling that we could do this, because I think people worried. And then I think the other thing that allowed this particular policy response was the rise of technology companies. If it weren't for Netflix at home and Amazon Prime and Uber Eats delivering your food and Zoom, so we could still, white collar workers like us could still engage in our livelihood, I think you wouldn't have had this policy response. Like people like us working at Twitter and Facebook, if we were being laid off in droves, I think we would find some way to come back to work and stagger our shifts and wear masks or whatever we want to do. But your specific question, how does one know if a lockdown helped or hurt a country? You can look at these aggregate totals, but I think there's a few factors to consider. One, seed load. Seed load is something I don't hear people talk much about, but seed load means that when the entire world panicked in the first 2 weeks of March, there were already so many cases on the ground. And that number is probably very different in economic hubs like Western Europe and in the United States than a nation like Australia. I don't know what the seed load is. I don't know what the seed load per capita is, and I don't know the interaction between seed load and population density. Yes.
And by seed load, you mean what I'm shedding as a carrier of COVID? What do you mean by
just
seed load?
How many people out of 100,000 people in Australia and March 10th had COVID? And how many people out of 100,000 people in the United States had COVID? Because that's the original seed that led to the propagation, even if we put walls between all the countries. The other thing about COVID-19 is it is very chaotic, stochastic spread. It has a sort of a right tail distribution. A few events lead to a lot of people getting it rather than lots of events leading to few people getting it. And that creates a lot of randomness in this kind of situation. And so I guess coming back to the point, one can imagine that with a very low seed load, a lockdown can actually take a small seed load and extinguish it. But once a seed load gets above a certain threshold, no amount of lockdown, even the welding the doors shut in Wuhan, that kind of lockdown, Shanghai lockdown, even that cannot contain spread if it gets above a certain threshold. I don't know the answer to this question. We don't really have broad-scale surveillance data from that time, but I think it will be something for economists and others to mull over. The natural geography of a place, the ability to control your borders, the ability to screen people on entry, very different from a country that abuts other countries and a country that's an island nation. I think maybe even pre-existing differences in immune susceptibility, perhaps, maybe even differences in BMI, age structure of a population may have led to different COVID-19 outcomes, particularly age structures that are younger, where a lot of young kids will get it early. I'm just tossing out factors that might be implicated, but I guess everyone has a story to tell. We pick two countries and we say, why did Denmark do this, right? But as an economist, the holy grail will be a model that you construct that explains data across many diverse settings and actually does it. And I think it's a 20-year project, but I look forward to reading those papers. I think they'll be terrific.
I'm not. Although I hope I'm alive to read them. The reason I'm not is that there'll be a variable called lockdown. And it gets back to my point earlier, which is
it should be.
How people actually responded in practice And I will give you just as an example, or at least a furthering of this question. After 7 days of the virus, I still tested positive.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt a lot better. I didn't feel 100%. I felt a lot better. And I think I was following somebody's guidelines. I felt it was okay to go outside. It was okay to go inside if I wore a mask. And I didn't test again. Not so much because I wanted to, well, what if it's still positive? Just like, after this length of time, I know people can test positive for a long, long time. I'm probably shedding a very, very small amount of virus. I probably shouldn't get in somebody's face and talk to them, whispering for 10 minutes. But other than that, I thought it was okay to go outside. Many people made fun of me, by the way, here in Israel, because they said, "Oh, everybody has it." I mean, what are you talking about? Get to go. After 5 days, you go outside. I was uneasy doing that. Maybe I was overly cautious, but I felt I should not spread it further. Was I being silly?
No, but I think you were being a good person. I mean, that's the kind of person you are. Nobody wants to knowingly contribute to somebody else getting sick. I think we never wanted to do that pre-COVID, and we don't want to do that now. But I think in terms of the scientific question, which is by testing positive, and I suspect you used a home antigen test.
Yes, I did.
By testing positive on a home antigen test, are you really infectious? And how infectious are you? And how infectious are you compared to the person who's in that pre-syndromic phase, don't even know that they have COVID? And the answer is, it's a very difficult question. There are some studies that compare home antigen tests to, can you culture the virus? And they use that as a surrogate. But these are all surrogates of the thing you care about, which is what do you, Russ Roberts, actually infect someone else? And to my knowledge, I can't think of any, and listeners can tell me if I'm wrong, I don't know of any study that has taken PCR levels, antigen levels, or even any test you want, and correlate it against the gold standard of, does someone infect someone else in the real world? Yeah, and then one last thing about lockdowns, just to come to your point. I absolutely agree lockdowns is not a monolith. It's many things. And so I could imagine that if you're developing this sort of economics model, what you want is one variable should be voluntary behavioral change using cell phone tracking data. Because that means without any policy, the moment I see the cases going up on the news, I'm staying in my house. I'm going to the grocery store less often, voluntary behavioral change. That's not a government policy. Then on top of that, business closure, school closure, stay-at-home order, shelter-in-place order. And then you could even add for some other countries, the more aggressive metrics like, different types of restrictions on that, masking orders. And then the last thing I would say is one should... each of these things should be queried and to see if it has an impact.
Yeah, we'll get to masks, I hope, but that's a perfect example. Mask mandates. For the last few months, I often take a bus to work, and for quite a while, you were required to wear a mask on a bus in Israel, and almost everyone wore them, but a lot of them were wearing them under their chin, and that's not in the data set usually. Right. I just want to say, by the way, that when I ask people who have or have gotten COVID, do you know where you got it? I almost always say no. I got it from my wife, and heroically took the brunt of it. She had a much milder case. Now, of course, it's not really true that I got it from my wife. That's not a fact. I did get it the day after she got it. Mm-hmm. But
you both may have got it at the same place.
Exactly. Yeah. So it's just, kind of a... Anyway. Let's talk about children, young children. It's recently been approved, I think recently been approved, that children under the age of 5 are now eligible. Is that the right word for the vaccine? Or encouraged to get the vaccine? What's the right language?
I guess 5 and up have emergency use authorization, and under 5, the FDA voted yesterday to give it, but they haven't yet given the EUA. But it's imminent, it's coming. So they will be permitted to receive vaccine under emergency use authorization and not not vaccine approval.
Okay. Yeah, which is...
maybe that's not even more clarifying.
I hate that
I know.
Emergency use authorization. It's not approved.
It's not approved.
But
it's authorized.
It's authorized.
Yeah, it's authorized.
It's not really funny, unfortunately. So I've noticed on Twitter that there's something about that this emergency use authorization is based on 10 cases. Is this true? 10? And what does that mean? What happened there? What's going on there?
Well, that number comes from the number of cases that occurred after the third dose of the Pfizer-BioNTech vaccine in kids under the age of 5, and it is a 10-case difference, and then they're saying that's why we have, quote, 80% efficacy. I think that's a very problematic statement. Yeah.
Let's slow down. Let's unpack that because, first of all, I thought it was a trial based on 10 kids. That's the way it comes across on Twitter.
I see, 10 events,
So let's slow down. So we had, just describe it again.
Okay. Maybe I'll back up a little bit and give some broader, and then I'll tell you why they get that number from. The broader context is basically, after the adult vaccine trials of 18 and up, drug regulators had a choice in terms of what kind of evidence they need to move down to younger ages. And of course, either below 16 or below 18, depending on the particular vaccine. Moderna was below 18 and Pfizer was below 16. And the choice they went with was immunobridging. And what does immunobridging mean? Immunobridging means is that we're no longer going to ask the manufacturer to prove that you reduce symptomatic SARS-CoV-2. So the initial randomized trial of the Pfizer vaccine and the Moderna vaccine, the primary endpoint was symptomatic, laboratory-confirmed COVID-19 infection. You had to have symptoms. You didn't have to have severe symptoms. You could have just had a sore throat and a cough, but you had to have a positive test, and that was the primary endpoint.
You had to have a positive test, meaning to be counted as a person who had COVID. So there was a group of people who were the control, a group of people that were given the vaccine. The people in the control, some of them got COVID-19, and you're saying that definition of getting it was symptoms.
Plus test.
Plus a test. And similarly, the people who were given the vaccine, some of them, of course, got sick anyway, but most of them did not, and that was wonderful. And everybody said, great, hooray. The number that was bandied about was 92 or 95%,
right?
Which is very confusing because it's not 95% of the people didn't get it. It's a complicated calculation. We don't have to do that right now. But that was the original way that the vaccine was evaluated.
Absolutely. It was a 90 to 95% relative risk reduction. They were 95% less likely to get it, but the raw number of people who got it was, I think, about 1% and change. Very low number of people actually got it, and the other arm was, 95% reduction from that number. And that was in older people. That was, I think, I found it very credible. There also was a signal in that trial. The trial was very large, 40,000 person randomized trial, that not only are you preventing the infection, you're preventing severe disease and hospitalization. There was a difference in severe disease and hospitalization. And I believe it was statistically significant, although it was not the primary endpoint of the study, and the study wasn't designed for it, but they happened to find it. And that's what made people like me so reassured that this was going to be a great thing. And that's why we popped the champagne. When they moved to younger and younger ages, I think they had a choice. The choice was, are we going to make the manufacturer prove this over and over again, that they reduce symptomatic disease or even hospitalization? And there are some purists in evidence-based medicine, and I put myself in this camp, that felt like they really needed to make the manufacturer prove that. And the reason being, as you drift down in ages, the risk to the kids is even lower and lower, and the potential upside is lower. Yes.
The risk of having a severe reaction to COVID or getting it is lower and lower.
In fact, it's so low that a 4-year-old has a lower risk than a triple vaccinated 40-year-old, for instance, in terms of a severe outcome from COVID-19. An unvaccinated 4-year-old is lower than a triple vaccinated 40-year-old, just to put it in perspective. So it's very, very low. And to do that study, to prove a reduction in severe disease or even symptomatic disease, you need large randomized controlled trials, maybe hundreds of thousands of people. Now, many people believe that those are financially not feasible and practically not possible, but I want to remind people that Jonas Salk himself did a 400,000 person randomized trial of the polio vaccine many decades ago. I also want to remind people that Pfizer has been well compensated for their vaccine. Their revenues this year will be $100 billion plus, and maybe $50 billion is on the backs of Paxlovid and the vaccine. So we're giving these manufacturers a lot of money. And then the last thing I want to say is the appetite to enroll your child on this study, I think, is very high. Even though vaccine rates in children in the United States are about 1 in 3, that 1 in 3 is very motivated. And so, I think that we see vaccine rates in children plateau at about 33% or something like that in 5 to 11. Go ahead.
You're saying vaccine rates of the COVID vaccine?
Yes. So 66% of parents are not doing it so far.
Okay. But there's still, when you say enthusiasm, appetite, there's still a large group that thinks it's a good idea and they're doing it. And so we could use that data, you're saying.
Yes. There'll be, if you did a randomized trial and made it easy to enroll, you'll get 1 million people in 1 week because there's 1 million people who really want their kid to have a shot at it, And so I think all of the usual barriers to randomization are not present. You could have done the big studies.
Well, except that it's not going to be a random sample of the adults of America with kids under the age of 5. Because
that's absolutely true. It will be a
income.
Yes.
Your earlier point. Yeah.
Correct. Between placebo arm and vaccine arm, it'll be randomized. But you're right; it's a select subgroup. But to be fair, I think that also applies to the original trials, right?
Sure, absolutely.
But the FDA decided to go a different way. They went with what they call immunobridging, and immunobridging basically means prove to me you have the same antibody levels in these younger ages as older ages had, and that's the primary endpoint of the study. If you happen to also have detect a difference in symptomatic disease, that's great, but we're not asking you to prove that. And that comes to this youngest trial that you're talking about. In the Pfizer study, when you randomize kids, they initially planned 2 doses, and they had 2 doses to show they had the sufficient antibody level. 2 doses of the Pfizer vaccine in kids under the age of 5 failed to generate that antibody level, so they added a 3rd dose in a protocol modification. And then in terms of the actual rates of symptomatic SARS-CoV-2, and you could put a link to it, maybe I'll send you the figure, there's a nice cumulative incidence figure that just shows almost overlapping curves. There really didn't appear to be much of a difference. For the other product, maybe we're talking about a 20 to 30% reduction in symptomatic disease, and the study has no power for severe disease. I mean, there's so few cases, you can count on one or 2 hands how many cases there were. There's just no ability to see any signal for severe disease. So putting this all together, this is a vaccine to the original Wuhan strain. It generates antibodies to the original Wuhan strain. I'm not very confident there's much of a difference in symptomatic SARS-CoV-2 if you give it to a kid. I have no confidence that you lower severe disease. I mean, there's just no signal. And then the last bit of nuance is, since these vaccine trials have been going on, kids have been getting infected with COVID. And in the United States, the CDC says at least 75% of kids in this age group have already gotten COVID. And it's very difficult to take a kid who's already at low risk, who already had COVID and already did well, and give them a vaccine that will even lower that risk even further. I think that's very difficult. And so that's why I think it's a very controversial space.
But we don't have, well, let me ask first question. Yeah. There's a bit of a debate breaking out in Twitter recently about the risk to young people.
Yeah.
Let's not say young people, children.
Yeah.
Young children. When I mean young children, I mean 5 and under. So in the early days of COVID, the argument was flu is more dangerous than COVID for young people, and for old people, they're both unpleasant and dangerous, flu and COVID. Yes. But COVID's much worse, and there's a big debate about whether we should have focused all our efforts. Not a big debate, unfortunately. There's some debate whether we should have focused all our efforts on the 80 and older, or the frailest and weakest and immuno-challenged folks. But this question about young people, I thought was sort of settled. That young children, it's just such a low risk. And there've been a couple studies published recently that said, no. Actually, it's dramatically higher than flu, and they should be protected also. Is that correct? Do you think it's correct? Do we know?
I mean, I think I know the blog post that got all that coverage, and I believe it's an incorrect blog post in a number of ways. So, I think listeners of your podcast can go pull up a chart from the Financial Times. And this Financial Times chart shows the infection fatality rate by age. And it shows in 2 times, March 2020 and then, March 2022. And in both time periods, and particularly in the new time period with and this is from the United Kingdom, from the circulating strains, the risk of a child who gets COVID-19 from getting it at those ages is much lower than it is had they gotten flu. So if nobody wants to say this, but I mean, if your 4-year-old had to get either flu or COVID, it's better for them to get COVID than the flu. Okay, so I think that's one fact. The reason this statistic exists that somebody said COVID is actually worse than flu is that in the Omicron winter wave in this country, many, many children got COVID-19. And some of those children ended up being hospitalized. And if you look at the total number of kids who became ill with COVID-19, it's a lot. I mean, in one short period of time, a lot of kids got it. And so if you look at the aggregate number of, say, hospitalizations or deaths, it might look bad, but there's two problems. One is we still do a very bad job of differentiating somebody who comes in the hospital with COVID or from COVID. You know, hospitals have universal COVID swabbing on entry. Everybody getting into the hospital is being swabbed. So if you come in and you've been in a car accident and you get swabbed, I mean, that may inadvertently be coded as a COVID death or even a COVID hospitalization. If you break your arm and it tests positive for COVID. And there is not, to my knowledge, really a well-done study that really pulls these two apart. Even today, we still struggle with that. We never looked for flu the way we look for COVID. We didn't screen everyone for flu on entry who were asymptomatic. That was never a practice. And so we're looking much harder and we're finding it much more often. And then the other thing I think it's missing is that parents don't necessarily care about what the risk was to my kid in December. Parents are caring about what the risk is to my kid this December. And I think that if that's the case, then one should acknowledge that the fact that maybe even 75 or 80% of kids have had and recovered from COVID means the risk to your kid this December from COVID is even lower. And flu is actually probably much more salient a risk because flu can actually reinfect people much more severely than COVID.
And let's be clear, this is not the Olympics. We don't care about which is really riskier.
Correct.
And the other thing I want to emphasize, and I think this is really hard for people to remember, it could be that the risk of COVID is twice as high as the risk of flu for death, but it's still very low. And we all sometimes that doesn't matter, but sometimes it does. Sometimes, if it's a very unlikely event, you don't want to do something that has a high cost. I mean, the thing that just to skip ahead a little bit, and what I'm hoping we'll talk about. The relentless masking of small children in social settings and creating fear in children of becoming physically close to their peers is I think, a bad thing. I know it can't be quantified. I don't think it may not be measurable in any way. I don't think we're going to know whether kids can recover from that emotionally or whether it's just an unimportant game. It's no different than going out on Halloween. We'll never know. But my intuition is that human beings were designed to talk to each other through and to see each other's faces and our eyebrows and smiles, and they're not unimportant. So we could debate that, but depriving a child of that level of human interaction to reduce a risk that's tiny, tiny, tiny is something an economist would bring up. And many people would respond saying, but every single death, even one, is a tragedy. And my view is that it certainly is a tragedy, but millions of children being emotionally stunted is also a tragedy.
Yeah.
And I don't have an easy way to compare those two. I would never say I know how many emotionally stunted kids equals how many deaths, but I think we should be aware of both of those effects. And I understand that the death is measurable, sort of. It kind of isn't for the reasons you just talked about, which is a whole nother horrible part of this public health issue here, which is that the death counts are slightly disturbing. Yeah. Having said that, we have some measures of we do have pretty good measures, I think, of unusual death rates overall, whether it's all due to COVID, excess death. Mm-hmm. Some of it could be due to other consequences of policy responses to COVID, but it's not irrelevant. It does bring one. It is thought provoking, but my point is that I just don't think we should ignore these other costs, and I'm not suggesting I have an easy way to take them into account, but I think they're relevant.
Russ, I absolutely agree with you. I mean, just one quick point about excess death. I think, obviously, excess death is observed minus expected deaths. That's the calculation. And I think there's a lot more nuance to expected deaths than meets the eye. One is that as populations keep going year after year, there's constant aging. And so expected death should always be age adjusted for the population ticking up a little bit older. And that's not always done in some of these studies. And anyway, but I'll put that aside. But back to the kids.
That's important.
It's important, yeah. To the kids, I guess it's not just my intuition, also everything I've read or written about this topic. I think that almost the majority of our response in shielding children from this virus has been irrational and not proportionate to the risk they face. When we were kids, our parents would happily put us in the backseat of a car, and we lived in Cleveland, Ohio, and drive to Florida to visit relatives. Now, that's a long drive. There's a risk to the child to being taken on that long automobile ride. It's a low risk, but it was a risk they felt was worth it so we could visit loved ones and relatives. In the New York Times, they have an article in the last week where it talks about some of the most extreme parents and what they've done in response because they are legitimately worried about their own children, and I don't blame them. But what they've done is they're talking about 3-year-olds who have never been on a play date, 2-year-olds who say, "Is he real, mommy?" when they see another child, kids who have never seen the lower part of the face of another child, kids who don't go on, have never been to a Thanksgiving, never had a birthday party. This is, I think, history will view this as very disproportionate and cruel. School closure, I think, is the most abysmal policy choice because, as you and your listeners will well know, is that schools is a great engine for upward mobility and for wealth, which is a proxy for health and living longer. And I think we will see declines in life expectancy as a result of the impact of school closure. And then I share your sentiment that it is, the American Academy of Pediatrics, I think, to their discredit, they had a tweet that said, "No evidence shows that a baby not seeing the lower part of a face is detrimental." And my response to that was, I think that's technically true. No evidence shows that. But no society has ever done that to children for so long. And so one would not expect to have a nice historical group to go to because people would have thought it absurd. We can talk about our masking policy on kids. I think, we deviate from World Health Organization here in the States. And it's taken sort of a religious fervor beyond what I think the evidence supports.
Let's turn to masks next. But how old are you?
39.
Yes, I thought you said, I think you said something about 40. When we took that car trip, my sister and I and my brother, and I was born in 1954, so we're talking, 1962. My brother hadn't been born yet, but a typical car trip was, we made a big car trip from Moses Lake, Washington to Memphis, Tennessee to Lexington, Massachusetts, a big V. And my sister and I fought. I was 8 and she was 5 or so, and or something like that. And we would fight constantly over who would get to lay down in the shelf of the back window during the ride because not only did we not have seatbelts, but we didn't even sit in the seat. So when you said, you put the kid in the back seat, you're talking about the fact that car travel is on average more dangerous than airline travel. And it's not safe, 100% safe. It's dangerous, as most things worth doing in life are. Let's talk about masks. I see numerous smart people wearing cloth masks, or I don't know if they're cloth. They're more like paper. They're not the... So let's talk about 3 different kind of masks.
Sure.
The first thing, by the way, is that, in the early days, there was that study, I think it came out of Duke University, that showed this crude, non-scientific, really bad study. And the gaiter, where
it was worse.
The person who wore a thing that went down to their neck did worse. And so my synagogue banned those gaiters. And I explained to the, and then someone would show up with one, not knowing it was banned. And they were treated as sort of a renegade poisoner. And I would reassure them that the evidence that their gaiter was not effective was really quite small, right? Bad evidence. There was no evidence for it. Still, it was a stupid, really, really bad study. But let's talk about 3 types of masks. There are cloth masks. They're like that gaiter, the thing that people might wear over their face, nose and mouth, their nose and mouth. There are the N95s, which are kind of a hard shell, plasticky kind of thing. They're less pleasant to wear. And there are also the N95 knockoffs, by the way, which I wonder about. And then there's this thing that comes in a box. The mask is rectangular. It has a bunch of layers. It looks like something you would see in a medical ward. So I see a lot of people wearing them as if they are in armor. And I don't make fun of them, but I often observe that I worry that it's a form of theater. And I'm curious what you think we know about these different kind of masks. And you can add in, by the way, about the can washing and the washing of cans and mail and other surfaces.
It's a good question. And then, listeners who are interested in this section can find, myself and colleagues, we published on the Cato Institute website a 80-page review of community masking. I guess I want to draw just a couple of distinctions here, which is one, the N95 mask. When we talk about N95 mask, what it means is literally it's filtering particles of a certain size and 95% of those particles. And as a healthcare worker, I've worn an N95 mask often when I go and visit a patient with tuberculosis and now a patient with COVID-19. And as a healthcare worker, you have to be fitted, which means you put the mask on and go into a booth, and they put a sort of an odorous chemical, and you have to say if you can smell it or not. And of course, if you can smell it, it means it's leaking around the mask, and that's not good. And so it is.
You mean you don't just pinch that little metal part at the top? I thought, really? Oh,
yeah,
darn.
It's more than pitching the metal. And or even worse, I see people wearing, as you point out, the knockoff KF94s or N95s with huge gaps by the nose, or the air is just traveling by the path of least resistance. So I guess one thing I want to say is that I'm very confident that if I go in the patient's room with an N95, the patient could have active tuberculosis or COVID and filling the whole, poorly ventilated room. And I'm very confident that I won't get ill. One, because I'm fit tested. Two, because I know going in that he's got COVID and I know to be vigilant. It's a time limited thing. I'm in there for 10, 15 minutes and then I'm out. That's very different, to say that the quote unquote, we know masks work. I agree. We know under that circumstance, masks work. Better to do that than to go in without anything on. But that's very different than the policy of should we advise average people to wear a mask in their day-to-day life, that sort of community policy. And that's always been highly disputed. There have been studies pre-pandemic of healthcare workers in influenza season being randomized to different masks, yielding sort of diffuse conclusions. And the pre-pandemic consensus was largely because there was no evidence. And this is why when Fauci got on TV the first time, he said, we don't advise you to wear the mask. The pre-pandemic consensus was that we just don't know that this works. And so we cannot advise it. In a very short period of time, in the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, in the throes of, I think, a lot of anxiety, people did a full 180 on that and started to endorse community cloth masking. I didn't disagree. I mean, I think you can do things out of the precautionary principle all the time. But what I really heavily disagreed with were that there were ongoing efforts to run cluster randomized trials in developed Western nations that were, I think, actively thwarted by sort of a maybe even well-intentioned propaganda or lobbying effort to get people to do it. And so, the United Kingdom didn't run any cluster randomized trials of cloth masking. The United States ran 0. No nation in the whole world, and nobody actually ran any in children, and nobody ran anyone in the place of greatest dispute, kids from 2 to 5. So we are going to leave this pandemic with very little sort of really well done studies on this topic, and it was an imminently answerable question. The next thing I'd say is that
what should we have done? What should we have done? What do you mean by a clustered randomized trial? You would have done what?
Yeah, so I'll tell you about the one that was done, and that'll give you, I think we should have done in the United States. So Abeluk, Jason Abeluk from Yale University, who's an economist, he ran, to my knowledge, one of 2 cluster randomized trials. The other is in the Guinea-Bissau. It's not yet reported. And he ran his in Bangladesh. He chose rural Bangladesh because he knew at the time of his study, and I believe this was in the fall of 2020, early 2021, that they had very little prior COVID-19 there. The baseline seroprevalence was very low. And he randomized hundreds of villages to 3 different strategies: no masking, cloth masking, or a surgical mask. And these are a little bit different than the masks you see. I think he actually specifically had these manufactured. And he, as all good economists, not only did he do a simple, randomized trial, he also had different incentive structures to get people to wear it. He had blind people observe villages to see what the level of compliance was. He found many notable things. One thing he found was that control villages maybe had something like a 10% compliance rate with mask wearing, even though they weren't given a mask and weren't told to wear masks. The intervention villages, it went up to like 40%. So he did have some, delta on that masking. And the rate of COVID, and the primary endpoint of the study was you had to have symptoms. You phoned a number, and they wrote down how many people had symptoms. But then they used blood test confirmed COVID-19 to validate that it was COVID-19 and not just that you were worried you had a tickle in your throat. And by that primary endpoint, the control villages had a rate of COVID-19 of, I believe, 0.76. And the intervention arm villages, it was 0.69. So that's the statistically significant 11% risk reduction, but we're talking about 3/4 and two-thirds of 1 percentage point, and a very tiny effect. And actually, it was only true for the group that had the surgical masks and not the group that got the cloth masks. Cloth masks did not work in that study. So I think that's why a lot of us felt like cloth masking was an ineffective strategy. One of the problems of the Abeluk study, and he may disagree, and I know he'll disagree, but one of the problems is there's an imbalance in randomization. In the villages that he gave a mask out, about 10% more people signed up to participate than the villages where he didn't give a mask out. And of course, this is all randomly generated villages. So how could that be? That's a statistically significant 10% imbalance. And I think the answer is that when they went to randomize people, the villagers knew that they were going to get a freebie in the villages where they had the mask. They pulled up in maybe in a big truck and they had boxes. And in the other village, they didn't think they were going to get a freebie. And this is a bias called concealment bias. Randomization wasn't concealed from the participants. And what that led to was a 10% imbalance in sign up. And the reason I'm saying this is because I think the results of the study hinge on one thing: that 11th person who signed up in the villages that got a mask versus the 11th person who didn't sign up, is that person equally likely to phone that number and report their symptoms if they are ill? And I would argue that they're not equally likely. They're the kind of person who only is signing up because they think they're getting a freebie. And if they weren't getting a freebie, they're not going to sign up. And so if they have symptoms, they probably don't really care that much about your study. And they may not call you. And so I think that the entire result should have a little asterisk next to it, because it might just be due to imbalances in randomization. So that's my thought on it.
But isn't it such a tiny incidence in that setting that
yes,
it's not a very reliable
result,
and it's not probably a setting where a lot of people go to choir practice or basketball game in a crowded arena or sit in a big restaurant with 60 other people. I don't know. It just strikes me as maybe not that informative in either direction. But that's what we had. You're telling me.
That's all we have. But I will also add to you, and that's why I say that what we should have done that exact same thing in the United States. I mean, we should have matched municipalities and cluster randomize them. And I mean, if you think about you'll know better than me. What will be the global losses from this pandemic? I mean, 20 trillion, or even in the United States, I mean, tens of trillions of dollars. And I think a nation that is willing to, print 5 trillion in money and lose 20 trillion in GDP, but is not willing to spend, 10 million, 100 million on running sort of just basic public health randomized trials, I think that to me is a problem. And then the last thing I'd say is the CDC complains that trust in public health is reaching an all-time low. And I think that there's evidence of that to be the case. And this issue, like masking, is supposed to be a science issue. It's become a political issue. I know that you're voting for Biden when I see you wear the mask, and I know you're not when you're voting for Trump when you don't. And it wouldn't have been a political issue if we had taken it over as a scientific issue. If we had run the study, I think we would have diffused a lot of it. But politics thrives in a evidence vacuum. I mean, there is no evidence that cloth masking helps or hurts, and there's no evidence it helps or hurts kids. And naturally, the right will say, it's child abuse, and the left would say that if you don't do it, you're a child abuse. It becomes a political issue, and that's very dangerous for society, I think.
So I've made the following observation, which I think is true. It might not be, but I think it's true. In the early days of the pandemic, I was a big supporter of mask wearing. I felt in the early days, I still not against it, although I am for kids, or would be for my own kids. If what you do with your kids is up to you. But I felt at the time relatively small cost for adults and
correct,
potentially good, high benefit. So wear them. I remember when President Trump came out for a press conference early in the pandemic surrounded by 10 other people, all really standing close together, none of them wearing masks. And I thought, that's a terrible, it used to be so easy for him to send a signal. So the thing I think is true, which unverifiable, won't be a study 20 years from now about this. Nobody's going to be arguing about it. But I always wondered if he had come out religiously wearing a mask and said everybody should wear a mask, I wonder if the mask religion would be reversed.
Yes.
That the Republicans would be saying, masks are the only or the best thing we've got. And the Democrats would be saying it's an infringement on our civil liberties. How dare them? How dare they tell us to do something that we have no evidence for? But that experiment will never be run. So anyway.
Democrats would say exactly as you say, and they would also say that we know facial recognition is very important for young children and we should not put it on young children. And they would also say we know people of color are disproportionately harassed if they're wearing a mask or feared or something like that, and it's unsafe for people of color. I think Democrats would have had that opposite view. There is evidence to what you're saying when it comes around school closure. There was a week in June 2020 where Trump came out publicly in favor of school reopening. And if you look at public opinion polling, and I think Vladimir Kogan from Ohio State has done this, you will see an inversion by party in whether or not schools should be opened the moment Trump put his finger on that issue. And that's why we see today left-leaning progressive school districts in this country were the longest closures, and it was Texas and Florida that reopened quickly. And I guess the reason it really bothers me is that, just because a broken watch is right twice a day. He was right about the schools. And I think, many people just irrationally opposed him. On the masks, I'm actually very close to you, Russ. I never minded wearing it. It's no big deal. I wear pants. I wear a lot of things, right, just out of social convenience. I never minded it. But I do mind that we didn't generate the data. That really bothers me. I would have loved to see the CDC on many issues run that study.
Yeah. Well, there were a number of just a small technical question. And by the way, I just want to say for listeners, Vinay is only visible from the waist up. So his claim that he wears pants, there's no evidence for it. Just want to say that.
It's false. It's not falsifiable.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So I'm sitting here breathing, and I'm putting out particles all the time. And I assume there'd be a way to measure when I'm wearing one kind of mask versus another kind of mask, how much of my breath gets out a certain distance. Can't we get some evidence like that? I mean, we know something. We know something about the size of COVID particulates that are troublesome, and we know what a cloth mask does versus a paper mask versus. Can't we get some? I don't know what you would call that, micro evidence. I don't know.
No, and I think there are. I mean, I think when you see statistics like the N95 is X percent and this is Y percent, it often is a type of study like that. They're typically performed a mannequin in a chamber measuring exhaled particles. Yeah. But just to draw a line, let's just take 2 to 4 year olds in California. Throughout most of the pandemic, 2 to 4 year olds by law in daycare had to wear a cloth mask. That was the public health policy, except when they nap, and because that's a safety risk when they're napping. And they nap, actually, Russ, all next to each other in the same room. They just kind of unroll some yoga mats and they all nap. And that room, of course, often has stagnant air. So I think the question I always asked is that how much good could this be doing if it's filtering some fraction of particles when y'all take it off and spend 2 to 4 hours taking a nice siesta? I mean, how good could it possibly be doing? And so that's why I always think that, the kind of study you're talking about, in my mind, is a bioplausibility study. It's like early drug development, but the proof is in the pudding, which is sort of real world, empirical, public health kind of studies.
Yeah, no, for sure. And there was, I haven't talked about this on the program for a while, but my understanding of the 6-foot mandate was that it was based on a single airplane observation about one person who had a different coronavirus, MERS or whatever it was, and how many rows away people got sick 3 days later, and therefore we just decided it's 6 feet. I mean, it's not science, which is okay. I always say that if somebody's trying to persuade you of something and the first thing they do is pull out a seating chart from an airplane, it's not science. I don't know what it is. It's not science. They got to pull out that seating chart. How about a restaurant? Because that was the other one. There was this restaurant where they had their air conditioning on, and everybody I haven't heard that one, but in line at the restaurant, everybody in the tables with the ventilating, they all got it. Nobody. Interesting. Could be true. Small sample. Let's close to talk about the public health establishment. In a recent episode of this program, can't remember which one, I said that Fauci had misled the American people, and I was a listener wrote me and said, no, it's not true. That's a lie. He just didn't have complete information at the time. My memory is that he conceded that he had lied and that he had done it in the name of preserving supply of masks for healthcare providers. Now, I've said many times on this program that just figuring out if that's even what I just said is a true statement is so overwhelmingly difficult now because of the polarization and politicization of information on the internet that I'm not totally sure that's true, but that's my memory. Can you speak to that and speak more generally of whether the public health experts have been honest and what that's done?
So that's a good point. So I guess I want to start by saying that actually I have a lot of respect for Tony Fauci, and I've actually met the man face to face. I did my training at the NIH, and I have a tremendous respect for him, and I think he's an important public servant in the history of this country. But I tend to agree with you that not only did he mislead or lie, he has admitted as such, at least on 2 occasions. One occasion is the occasion you describe where between early March and maybe about 6 or 8 weeks later, he gave conflicting reports about the efficacy of masking. He first said that, on 60 Minutes very clearly that nobody should community mask. It's silly. He made a joke, you need to touch your face. It's not going to work. A few weeks later, he was endorsing it. He later said that, well, I lied to you the first time, and the reason I did was a noble reason, which was I wanted to preserve mask supply for healthcare workers. But the problem I always had with that argument is when you came back the second time and recommended it, you didn't recommend people wear the N95 or the surgical mask. You recommended they take their T-shirt and cut holes in it and take their sock. And so if you were always going to recommend a homemade cloth mask, that would have never jeopardized the supply of the masks to the healthcare providers. And so there's a bit of a tension there. And then, to be honest, what I really think happened is I think it was the second time that he lied. The first time, I think, and actually I think historians will someday say that he was actually very much in line with WHO, CDC guidance and the preponderance of public health thinking. There was a very quick reversal in public sentiment. I think Jacob Hale Russell has a very brilliant article about this in Tablet magazine, The Mask Debacle, where he talked about that change in public sentiment. And I think when he came out the second time, he was maybe overly enthusiastic and upsold the mask, maybe in part because he wanted to get people to try it, and maybe he wanted to offer something. I mean, maybe he had a different noble intention. The second instance that I know he has admitted to lying was to the reporter Don McNeil. Don McNeil, of course, now the fired New York Times reporter, and that's a whole nother story. But Don McNeil had an article where he asked Fauci, what is the herd immunity threshold? And Fauci gave a number that varied, maybe 70, 75, 80, 85. He kept changing the number. And Don McNeil asked him, why are you changing the number? To which he remarked, I look at the public opinion polls on vaccines and I see what % of Americans are going to get it. And then I think to myself, I can nudge this up a little bit. Meaning that I think what he's saying is that if I push it up a little bit, I can motivate people to make a salutary choice. And then I think you can go back. There's a lot of comments of when Ron DeSantis reopened schools in the spring of 2020. I think Fauci said a lot of things that were wrong, that kind of oversold the risk to kids and actually may have further poisoned those efforts and kind of shifted the dynamics around teachers' unions. So I think like all public figures, he's fallible. He did make mistakes. And I think it's true of anyone in that situation. My own view is that at some point, as is often the case for spokespeople, you get caught in these lies a little bit too often that you maybe it's best that you're no longer the spokesperson. And I think sometime in the Biden administration, they felt that because he was no longer on TV all the time and he kind of stepped back a little bit.
And my view on this is that, like you say, everybody's human. We make mistakes. I think it's important to admit them. I have no idea whether he could. The fact that he admitted that he misled people doesn't mean he actually did. He could just be covering his embarrassment that he didn't know what was going on. Who knows? That's not so important. But I think admitting that you deliberately, whether it was true or not, misled the American people shows a lack of respect for the average person. Now, you could argue the average person deserves a lack of respect. And maybe, Tony Fauci feels that way, or maybe doesn't matter. But I do think, to come back to Yuval Levin's, I think, very deep insight, that it's we have responsibilities, and it's hard to live up to them in 2022. People tend not to. I think if you're an expert in a position of authority, you need to tell the truth. And if you make a mistake, you need to admit it. And I don't think that's anybody's strong suit. I think people like to be, they like the platforms that they perform on, and they're not so keen on responsibility. So that's I don't want to single out Fauci. I don't think he's alone. I think he's got an enormous amount of company. And I think all of it has diminished the ability of people to trust people who are experts. And there's some good things about that. It's not all bad, but I worry about the next pandemic. I worry about the next crisis of any kind. And of course, we're in many of them right now. And people are saying things I think are often not true, but they justify it by saying, well, I have to say it that way, otherwise people will do X, Y, Z. And anyway, why don't you close?
Well, I just want to just one comment on this.
Go ahead.
And then
yeah, go ahead.
I mean, I think what you said is really brilliant and is really the way I feel, which I think is that scientists in particular, when put in public health positions, even if they're put by politicians, I think they have a duty, first and foremost, to say the truth. And one of the things about the truth is often the truth is uncertain. Uncertainty isn't great when you want to motivate armies to go to war. Uncertainty isn't great when you want compliance, but uncertainty is honesty. And if you feign certainty when you don't have it, you will easily lose credibility. I mean, there's that video clip of Walensky saying that we know vaccinated people don't carry the virus. And of course, she at the time had already had some hints that was incorrect. And we've seen some things that have shaken my faith in public health, one of which is the resignations of Marion Gruber and Phil Krause. Marion Gruber and Phil Krause was the deputy and director of the U.S. Food and Drug Administration Vaccine Product Division, positions they've held for decades. They withstood the political pressure of Donald J. Trump. They didn't resign under Trump. But in the course of the pandemic, when we got to universal boosting, they resigned. And they've written many op-eds in Washington Post. They wrote a paper in The Lancet. They were always critical of the idea that we needed a booster for all ages. They were much more willing to consider booster for elderly, but not for younger people. They also, at one point, asked that the sample size of the kids' vaccine studies be increased, because I think they were also very concerned that maybe we're not measuring what really matters to kids, which is severe disease. And I think that their resignation, what in the New York Times was well covered, that they resigned because they felt White House pressure for them to approve boosters, and they didn't feel that was fair. That, to me, speaks to loss of trust. And I guess I would say that I'm very worried, Russ, that what might happen going forward is that this science, which I truly believe in, is this objective reality that whether you're Democrat or Republican, there is some science. And, there's some things we can say with certainty. But I worry that science will increasingly become a branch of political parties. And they'll have their scientists and we'll have our scientists. And we will literally be saying different things. And if we get to that state, I think we will truly have lost something, one of the things that have always made America great, which is some shared sense of science. And I think we will be extremely vulnerable to, as you say, any crisis. It could be climate, it could be astronomical debris, it could be any crisis where you need smart scientists, policymakers, and public preference to, that Venn diagram needs to interact. It's going to be, whatever the issue, there's going to be two polar views. There'll be no way to settle the issue. And I think the net result will be paralysis and just total failure. I'm very worried.
Yeah, it would be really bad if real science started to look like economics, where they have their scientists and we have ours, whoever they and we are. But let's go to our closing conversation, our closing issue. I thought naively, as I think you're hinting at here, that in the aftermath of a 2-year plus a very tragic experience where millions of people have died, that we would learn some lessons that we'd all agree on. We haven't. This is clear. I think, if I had to pick one thing we have learned, I think even though vaccination is not universal, I think most people understood correctly, and I think correctly, the vaccination is a good thing. For whom, how many times, that's a difficult question to answer. Mm-hmm. But that's kind of like all we got. And worse than that, I think a lot of the things we've learned about vaccination aren't quite true. like it doesn't spread. It doesn't. You can't once you've been vaccinated, you can't. You're not going to spread the disease. Those kind of things are just horrible that they got put into the intellectual space. So talk about what you think is the most important thing we should have learned going forward, and then this is a little more pessimistic. Are we really? There will be more, and are we unprepared for those in terrible ways because of the way we've handled this one?
More pandemics.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess what have been the strengths of what we've done? I guess, and then what? Yeah. So I guess I'd say that there were a few groups that actually did lead the way. There's the United Kingdom's recovery trial, and they were able to, in a short period of time, randomize tens of thousands of people to different drugs. And they're the ones that told us dexamethasone works, and they told us that convalescent plasma mostly doesn't work, and they gave us a lot of useful insights. And I think the development of things like that was a great boon. Vaccination, I think the science was a boon. I mean, the mRNA platform was incredible. It didn't exist before, and very likely it will be leveraged for many other things in the years to come. I think the initial vaccine and for the elderly saved many, many lives, and I think is probably the single greatest accomplishment. I always put our COVID response in a couple buckets. There's things you do that lowers your risk of bad outcomes when you meet the virus, and there's things you do that delays the time to meet your virus. And there's things you do that you think delay the time, but doesn't even do that. And so wearing cloth masks outside, like I see people, or, boarding up playgrounds. Those were things we did that we thought delayed the time to meet the virus, but probably didn't even do that. There are things you do that really do delay the time, being a hermit, staying in your house, preventing your kids from ever playing. They do. But in my mind, those only make sense when you're waiting for something from the first category, a risk reduction thing. And once you've had all the risk reduction, I don't think those make as much sense to me because the virus will circulate forever. The thing I think we did the weakest is my bias, which is I think we succumb in medicine so often to this fallacy that something worked well in a high-risk situation, so we should not question it as we go lower risks. I mean, when it comes to cholesterol medicines, statins work brilliantly if you've had a heart attack and high cholesterol. And now people talk about, well, should every 18-year-old take a statin? I think it's a very different question. I don't know. I'm not persuaded. But there are cardiologists who say that maybe it should be every 18-year-old. Some even say it should be in the water supply. We know chemotherapy works very well if you have, certain advanced cancer. Should we look earlier for pre-cancer and treat you with chemo? I'm still unsure about that. And I think the same pattern is true with COVID-19, where the vaccine works well in older, frailer people. Does every 4-year-old, even one that just had Omicron, does that 4-year-old really need it? And then all this, should it be mandated? Should it be required? I think those are all problematic spaces. I think the final thing that I would leave your listeners with is, I think there were perverse financial conflicts of interest. They weren't always the ones people thought, but there were some that I think are really problematic. In my mind, the testing industrial complex is one. This whole pre-departure testing to come back to the U.S. was finally dropped. There are many prominent physicians who are consulting for those testing companies. A lot of kids on college campuses are in this sort of quagmire of testing every week, and if there's a lot of cases, they make them stay in their dorm rooms. This is largely based on evidence generated by the testing industry, which has a very strong motive to keep us testing forever. But a number of European nations have gone the other way. They say, don't test kids unless they're really sick and need to go to the hospital. Don't test yourself unless you are eligible for some therapy. This is something that, we might have to some degree, live with. And the more you test, the more you can sort of paralyze systems. The same for, I think, conflicts of interest around Paxlovid and things like that, because I think Paxlovid works wonderful for an unvaccinated person at high risk. But I really don't know if it works for the 30-something-year-old tech worker who's gotten 3 shots in San Francisco who tells me he's taking it, And I think that there were those kinds of questions.
Normally I was going to end here, but while you were talking, I had a thought, and we didn't talk about it. It's kind of strikes me as kind of important. One of the extraordinary parts of the vaccine platform you alluded to earlier in this last part was that we could adjust it to the flavor that we have. Why are we still giving out Wuhan booster? That makes no sense. I don't get that. Like, as soon as Omicron hit, and I know many fewer people have died of Omicron than Wuhan or Delta, but we don't. It's unpleasant, right? And people again told me to get the fourth booster. I didn't do it, but it probably would have been a better idea. It would have made more sense to take a fourth booster if it was Omicron compliant, whatever the right epidemiological word is. Why didn't that happen?
I think that but I totally
like a
agree
big
with you.
stockpile of the old one when you use it up first.
That was one thought I had, actually. I did have that thought that they have set their commercial apparatus to make so much, and they do want us to exhaust that supply before they retool. That was one thought. But your point is 100% correct. The boon of the mRNA platform was that it was so quick to change direction, and yet we have not changed direction at all. There's one risk to changing direction, which I just want to leave your listeners with. There's talk right now that we're going to go to an annual COVID-19 shot. What should be the level of evidence for that? In my world, I'd love to see you prove to me that shot works in the Southern Hemisphere when they're having their winter surge, and then bring it to the Northern Hemisphere for our forthcoming winter surge. I worry that the FDA is going to have a regulatory apparatus that says, here are 3 strains. If you can prove to me you can hit these 3 strains, you can get marketing authorization. You don't really need to have large human trials proving it works. And the reason I'm a little worried about that is, in addition to the fact that they might miss, it might be for a strain that actually didn't turn out to be a problem, is that we never fully understood why we have myocarditis. And there may be something about that spike protein that has some part of it looks something like something on the myocyte, on the cardiac cell, and it creates an autoimmune reaction against your heart. If you change that spike protein, it's possible that you have less myocarditis. But I think it's also possible you have more myocarditis. There might be some strain that has a lot of myocarditis. And so I feel like one of the reasons they didn't retool is they felt like they were in an acceptable place in terms of safety and some amount of efficacy that was diminishing. And that they felt that if they retool quickly, there's a risk that they'll be more efficacious, but there's also a risk of unanticipated safety signal. And I think that might have been a barrier to them. And they said, I hate to say this, but if I was in their financial meetings, I would say that, the strategy from their financial standpoint for the company would be, you want to get people to be indebted to your product in perpetuity. That's the only way you're going to make a lot of money for years to come. So you need sort of an annual shot. We're going to get the annual shot. You need to make sure it's safe. But while we've already retooled our apparatus to make a lot of the original strain, we got to try to get that out as much as possible.
And there's no music on EconTalk, but in general, except for the theme music at the beginning, at the end. But this would be the place where we play some ominous violins or maybe an organ. Dun, 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 dun. My guest today has been Vinay Prasad. Vinay, it's been great talking to you. Thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thanks for having me, Russ.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.